The blood dripped from Josephine Ames's split lip as she stumbled through the darkness, clutching her shawl against the bitter Colorado night. Each labored breath sent spears of pain through her bruised ribs, but she pressed on, driven by a desperate need that outweighed her fear. Somewhere behind her, in the modest home on the edge of Cannon City that had become her prison, her husband would soon discover her absence, and his rage would be terrifying. The year was 1879, and Josephine had been Mrs. Thaddeus Blackwell for 3 torturous years. At 24, the vibrant young woman who had once dreamed of adventure and love had been reduced to a shadow, walking on eggshells around a man whose charming exterior masked a monster. Tonight's beating had been worse than usual, her punishment for a supper that had gone cold while Thaddeus drank at the saloon. When he had finally passed out in a drunken stupor, Josephine had seized her chance. Her destination lay ahead, a modest ranch on the outskirts of town, owned by Samuel Reeves, a quiet cowboy who had witnessed Thaddeus's rough handling of her in town last week. He had slipped her a note while her husband's back was turned. "If you ever need help, my door is open." Tonight, she was taking him up on that offer, though she had no idea what awaited her at the end of this desperate journey. The moon slipped behind clouds as Josephine limped along the road, each step jarring her injuries. Cannon City had grown substantially with the silver boom, but out here, beyond the edge of town, the houses were scattered across the rugged landscape. In the distance, she could just make out the silhouette of the Reeves ranch, a lantern burning in the window like a beacon. As she approached the property, a dog began to bark and Josephine froze. Moments later, the front door opened, spilling warm light onto the porch, and a tall figure stepped out, rifle in hand. "Who's there?" The voice was deep but not threatening. "Mr. Reeves," Josephine called weakly. "It's Josephine Blackwell. You said if I needed help." The figure lowered the rifle immediately and strode toward her. As he drew closer, the clouds parted, and moonlight illuminated the face of Samuel Reeves. At 30 years old, he was lean and weathered from years under the Colorado sun, with kind eyes that widened in shock as he took in her battered appearance. "Good Lord, Mrs. Blackwell," he breathed, instantly shrugging off his coat and draping it over her shoulders. "Come inside, quickly now." His gentle hand steadied her as they walked toward the house. Inside, the warmth enveloped Josephine like an embrace, making her dizzy with relief. The modest cabin was simple but clean, with a fire crackling in the hearth. "Sit here," Samuel guided her to a chair near the fire. "I'll fetch some water and bandages." Josephine sank into the chair, her body finally acknowledging the exhaustion and pain she'd been pushing aside. She watched as Samuel moved efficiently around the small space, gathering supplies. There was something comforting about his quiet competence. "He did this to you?" Samuel asked, though it wasn't really a question. He knelt before her with a basin of warm water and a clean cloth. Josephine nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "It's been happening for years. Tonight was worse." Samuel's jaw tightened, but his hands remained gentle as he cleaned the cut on her lip. "You're safe here," he said firmly. "No one's going to hurt you." "He'll come looking for me," Josephine whispered. "Thaddeus won't let me go easily. Let me worry about that." Samuel's voice held a steely resolve that made Josephine look up at him. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an unspoken understanding, a promise. "Why would you help me?" she asked. "You barely know me." Samuel's hands paused in their ministrations. "My mother lived with a man like your husband. No one helped her." His eyes clouded with old pain. "I was too young then to do anything. I'm not too young now." As he continued tending to her wounds, Josephine felt the first stirrings of something she'd almost forgotten: hope. Outside, the wind howled across the Colorado plains, But within these walls, for the first time in years, she felt sheltered from the storm. "You can take my bed," Samuel said, standing up after bandaging the last of her visible wounds. "I'll sleep out here by the fire." "I can't put you out of your own bed," Josephine protested weakly. "You're not putting me anywhere, I'm offering." His tone brooked no argument. "There's a nightgown of my sister's in the chest. She visits sometimes from Denver, should fit you well enough." He showed her to the small bedroom, plain but immaculately kept with a patchwork quilt spread across the bed. Before leaving her to change, he paused at the door. "Mrs. Blackwell, Josephine, I meant what I said. You're safe here for as long as you need." After he closed the door, Josephine changed into the borrowed nightgown, wincing as the fabric slid over her bruises. The bed welcomed her like an old friend, and despite her fear and uncertainty, exhaustion claimed her almost immediately. Her last thought before sleep took her was that Samuel Reeves's eyes reminded her of the sky before a storm, blue gray and deep, with something powerful contained within. Morning came too soon, sunlight streaming through the small window. For a moment, Josephine was disoriented, panic fluttering in her chest until she remembered where she was and why. The smell of coffee and frying bacon drifted under the door, and her stomach rumbled in response. After dressing in yesterday's clothes, she cautiously opened the bedroom door. Samuel stood at the stove, his back to her. He'd already been out to the barn, his boots were muddy, and his shirt sleeves were rolled up to reveal strong forearms. "Morning," he said without turning. "How'd you sleep?" "Better than I have in years," she admitted, hovering uncertainly in the doorway. "Sit," he gestured to the table. "Breakfast is almost ready." As they ate, Samuel outlined his plan. "I've got a friend in town, Sheriff Mills. Good man, trustworthy. I'll ride in today, tell him what's happened." "No," Josephine's fork clattered to her plate. "The law won't help. Thaddeus is friends with Judge Wilson. He's been to dinner at our house. He'll never—" "Mills isn't beholden to Wilson," Samuel interrupted gently. "And he won't stand for a man beating his wife, no matter who his friends are." "And if the law fails?" Josephine asked quietly. Something flashed in Samuel's eyes. "Then we'll find another way. You're not going back to him, Josephine, not while I have breath in my body." The certainty in his voice both comforted and frightened her. No man had ever stood up for her this way, not her father, who had been quick to accept Thaddeus's proposal despite her reservations, and certainly not Thaddeus himself, who had shown his true colors mere weeks after their wedding. "Why don't you rest today?" Samuel suggested, rising to clear the plates. "I've got chores to see to, then I'll ride into town. The ranch isn't much, but you're welcome to whatever you find. Books on the shelf there if you like reading." After he left to tend to his animals, Josephine explored the small ranch house. It was a bachelor's home, sparse but tidy. The bookshelf held an eclectic collection, some dime novels, but also volumes of poetry, history, and surprisingly, several books by female authors including George Eliot and the Bronte sisters. On the mantel, she found a photograph of a woman with Samuel's eyes, standing beside a grim-faced man. His parents, she guessed, noting the lack of joy in the woman's expression. There was a newer photograph of a young woman who shared Samuel's features, his sister, perhaps. By mid-morning, Josephine was restless. She had spent so many years keeping Thaddeus's house spotless that idleness felt wrong. She set about tidying the already neat kitchen, then found herself kneading dough for bread, a task that had always soothed her. Through the window, she watched Samuel working in the corral with a young horse. His movements were patient and gentle, a stark contrast to Thaddeus's harsh ways. When the horse finally allowed Samuel to slip a bridle over its head, she saw his face break into a smile that transformed his serious features. Samuel came in for dinner to find fresh bread cooling on the table and a pot of stew bubbling on the stove. "You didn't have to cook," he said, looking surprised. "I wanted to," Josephine replied. "It helps me think, and it's the least I can do to thank you." They ate in companionable silence until Samuel cleared his throat. "I spoke with Sheriff Mills." Josephine tensed, her spoon freezing halfway to her mouth. "He's agreed to help. Says Thaddeus came into town this morning asking if anyone had seen you. Mills played dumb, but he can't do that forever." "What happens now?" Josephine whispered. "Mills is going to pay Thaddeus a visit this afternoon. Warn him that he's being watched. It won't stop him, but it might make him think twice." "It won't," Josephine said with certainty. "It'll only make him angrier." Samuel's face hardened. "Then we move on to other options." "Other options?" "You could file for divorce. It's not easy for a woman, but with evidence of abuse, no court in Colorado would grant it," Josephine interrupted bitterly. "Not when Thaddeus controls everything I own, and even if they did, he'd never let me go. He's told me as much." Samuel studied her for a long moment. "Then perhaps it's time to consider a more permanent solution." "What do you mean?" "California," Samuel said, "or Oregon, somewhere he can't find you." Josephine stared at him, hope and fear warring within her. "You're suggesting I run." "I'm suggesting you live," Samuel replied simply. "But it's your decision, Josephine. I won't force you one way or another." That night, lying in Samuel's bed, Josephine turned his words over in her mind. Freedom seemed like an impossible dream, yet here was this man, practically a stranger, offering to help her achieve it. Why? What did he stand to gain? The questions plagued her until dawn, when she finally made her decision. She would go west, start a new life far from Thaddeus's reach. But first, she needed to retrieve something from her home, her mother's locket, the only thing of value Thaddeus hadn't sold or locked away. When she told Samuel of her plan over breakfast, he frowned. "It's too dangerous." "I'll go during the day while he's at work," Josephine insisted. "I know where he keeps the spare key. It will take me 10 minutes, no more." Samuel's objections continued, but Josephine remained firm. Finally, he relented. "At least let me drive you into town. I can wait nearby, keep watch." An hour later, Samuel's wagon approached Cannon City. He stopped well short of the Blackwell house, which sat on the eastern edge of town. "I'll be right here," he promised. "If you're not back in 15 minutes, I'm coming in after you." Josephine nodded, her throat tight with anxiety. She slipped from the wagon and made her way through back alleys until she reached her street. The house looked just as she'd left it, quiet and unassuming. Like Thaddeus himself, its respectable facade hid darker truths. She retrieved the key from beneath a loose board on the porch and let herself in. The house was silent, the air stale with the lingering sense of whiskey and tobacco. Moving quickly, Josephine headed for the small jewelry box Thaddeus kept in their bedroom. Her fingers had just closed around the locket when a floorboard creaked behind her. Josephine whirled around to find Thaddeus standing in the doorway, his face a mask of cold fury. "I wondered when you'd come crawling back," he said, his voice deceptively soft. "Thaddeus," Josephine gasped, backing away, "you're supposed to be at work. And you're supposed to be my wife," he snarled, advancing toward her. "Yet here you are, stealing from me." "It was my mother's," Josephine protested, clutching the locket to her chest. "The only thing I have left of her." "Everything you have belongs to me," Thaddeus growled, closing the distance between them with alarming speed. His hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with bruising force. "Including you." Josephine struggled against his grip, panic rising in her throat. "Let me go." "Never," Thaddeus hissed, his other hand reaching for her throat. "You're mine until death do us part. Remember those vows, Josephine," as his fingers tightened around her neck. Josephine fought with all her strength, kicking and clawing. Her hand connected with the oil lamp on the bedside table, sending it crashing to the floor. In an instant, flames leapt up the curtains. Thaddeus cursed, momentarily distracted, and Josephine seized her chance. She wrenched free of his grasp and ran for the door. Josephine. Thaddeus's roar followed her as she fled down the hallway, the fire spreading rapidly behind her. She burst out the front door into the bright Colorado sunshine, gasping for breath. Samuel was already running toward the house, having seen the smoke. "Josephine," he called, reaching for her. Before she could respond, Thaddeus appeared in the doorway, face contorted with rage. "You," he snarled, lunging toward Samuel. "You're the one who's been hiding her." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Thaddeus drew a pistol from his waistband. Samuel pushed Josephine behind him. 2 shots rang out in quick succession. Thaddeus staggered, looking down in confusion at the spreading red stain on his chest. Behind him, Sheriff Mills stood with his pistol still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. "Drop the gun, Blackwell," Mills ordered. Thaddeus swayed on his feet, his eyes finding Josephine's one last time before he crumpled to the ground. The next hours passed in a blur. The fire was extinguished before it could spread to neighboring houses. Sheriff Mills took statements from Josephine and Samuel while Dr. Peterson confirmed what they already knew: Thaddeus Blackwell was dead. It was self-defense, clear as day, Mills assured them as they sat in his office. "He drew on Reeves first. I saw it with my own eyes. There won't be any charges." Josephine sat numbly, the reality of her situation slowly dawning. She was free. Thaddeus could never hurt her again. Yet the price of that freedom, a man's life, however cruel he had been, weighed heavily on her. "What happens now?" Samuel asked, his hand resting protectively near Josephine's on the sheriff's desk. "Mrs. Blackwell is a widow," Mills said simply. "What she does next is entirely up to her." That night, back at Samuel's ranch, Josephine sat on the porch watching the stars emerge one by one. Samuel joined her, offering a cup of hot tea. "I should feel something," Josephine said quietly. "Grief, perhaps, or relief. Instead, I just feel empty." "That'll pass," Samuel replied, taking the chair beside her. "You've been through hell, Josephine. It takes time to find your way back." They sat in silence for a while, the night sounds of the ranch creating a peaceful symphony around them. "I still want to leave," Josephine finally said. "Not because I'm running anymore, but because there's nothing for me here now." Samuel nodded slowly. "Where will you go?" "I don't know." "West, like you suggested. Somewhere I can start fresh." "I have family in Oregon," Samuel offered. "My cousin has a place near Portland. Good land, growing community." Josephine turned to look at him. "Are you suggesting I go to Oregon?" "I'm suggesting we go to Oregon," Samuel said quietly. "If you'll have my company." Surprised, Josephine studied his face in the dim light. "Why would you leave your ranch, your life here?" Samuel's eyes met hers steadily. "The ranch was never meant to be permanent, just a stopping place until I figured out where I belong." He hesitated, then added softly, "Maybe what I've been waiting for is someone to belong with." The words hung between them, loaded with meaning. Josephine felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. "I hardly know you," she whispered. "I know," Samuel acknowledged. "And I'm not asking for anything more than the chance to help you get somewhere safe. What happens after that?" He shrugged. "That's for you to decide." Josephine thought about his offer. This man who had shown her nothing but kindness was willing to uproot his life for her safety. It seemed too good to be true, yet the sincerity in his eyes was unmistakable. "When would we leave?" she asked finally. "As soon as you're ready. Week or 2 to settle things here." Josephine nodded, feeling a sense of purpose take root where emptiness had been. "Then I accept your offer, Mr. Reeves. The ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Samuel, please." "Samuel," she repeated, the name feeling right on her tongue. "Thank you." In the days that followed, Josephine discovered a strength within herself she hadn't known existed. With Thaddeus gone, she was legally entitled to their house and possessions. She sold everything, the money giving her a sense of security she'd never experienced in her marriage. The town's reaction to Thaddeus's death and her association with Samuel was mixed. Some whispered behind their hands when she passed, but others, particularly the women, offered quiet words of support. Mrs. Peterson, the doctor's wife, even invited her for tea one afternoon. "My sister was married to a man like your husband," Mrs. Peterson confided. "She never found the courage to leave. I'm glad you did." Preparations for their journey west moved quickly. Samuel sold his ranch to a young couple from Denver looking to start a cattle operation. He seemed surprisingly unattached to the property, confirming what he'd told Josephine about it being merely a stopping place. The night before they were to leave Cannon City, Samuel and Josephine sat by the fire in what had been his home, surrounded by packed trunks and crates. "Are you nervous?" Samuel asked. "Yes," Josephine admitted, "but not afraid, not anymore." Samuel studied her across the flickering light. "You're remarkable, Josephine Ames." The use of her maiden name startled her. "How did you know?" Sheriff Mills mentioned it. "Said you might want to go back to it now." Josephine nodded slowly. "Josephine Ames," she repeated, as if trying on an old dress that still fit perfectly. "Yes, I think I would like that." Something shifted in Samuel's expression, a softening around his eyes. "It suits you." The journey west began with the spring thaw of 1880. They joined a wagon train in Denver, smaller than the great migrations of decades past, but still substantial. The other travelers were a mix of families, prospectors, and individuals like themselves seeking new beginnings. Josephine quickly proved her worth around camp, her cooking skills earning particular praise. Samuel handled the oxen with the same patient competence he showed in all things. They established a comfortable routine, sharing a wagon but maintaining propriety with separate sleeping arrangements. The landscape changed dramatically as they traveled, from the familiar mountains of Colorado to the stark beauty of the Great Basin. Josephine found herself captivated by each new vista, storing away mental images of sunsets over unfamiliar horizons. One evening, as they made camp near the Snake River, Samuel found Josephine sketching in a small book he'd given her in Denver. "You're quite talented," he remarked, looking over her shoulder at the rendering of distant mountains. "My father taught me," Josephine explained, "before he became obsessed with marrying me off to secure his business connections." Samuel sat beside her on a fallen log. "You never talk about your family." Josephine's pencil stilled. "There isn't much to tell. My mother died when I was 16. My father remarried a year later, a woman barely older than me who wanted nothing to do with her husband's daughter. When Thaddeus showed interest in me, father was only too happy to arrange the match. And you had no say." "I was 19, sheltered, and desperately lonely. Thaddeus was handsome, charming when he wanted to be. I thought marriage meant escape." She laughed bitterly. "I was right about the escape part, just not in the way I imagined." Samuel's hand covered hers briefly. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," Josephine said, surprised to find she meant it. "If things had been different, I wouldn't be here now." Their eyes met, and Josephine felt that same flutter in her chest. In the months since they'd left Colorado, she'd come to know Samuel Reeves as a man of quiet strength and unexpected depth. His kindness extended not just to her, but to everyone. They encountered a lost child separated from the wagon train, an elderly couple struggling with their oxen, even a dog with a thorn in its paw. Yet there was steel beneath the gentleness. She'd seen it when a drunk prospector had made unwelcome advances toward her at a trading post. Samuel hadn't raised his voice or thrown a punch. He'd simply stepped between them, his presence enough to make the man back down with mumbled apologies. "What are you thinking?" Samuel asked, drawing her back to the present. "That I'm glad to be here," Josephine answered honestly. "With you." Something flickered in Samuel's eyes, hope, perhaps, or longing, but he merely nodded and returned to discussing their planned route for the next day. As spring gave way to summer, the journey grew more challenging. They lost 3 days to a broken axle, and a week later, one of their oxen died crossing a particularly treacherous mountain pass. Water became scarce as they traversed drier terrain, and tempers in the wagon train frayed with the heat. Through it all, Samuel remained steady, his calm presence anchoring Josephine when anxiety threatened to overwhelm her. And increasingly, she found herself doing the same for him, offering quiet encouragement when the obstacles seemed insurmountable, sharing the load of their daily tasks without being asked. They were 2 weeks from Portland when disaster struck. A summer thunderstorm rolled in with little warning, turning the trail into a muddy quagmire. As they struggled to navigate a steep incline, their remaining oxen lost footing. The wagon lurched sideways, then began to slide toward the edge of the trail where it dropped off steeply. "Jump!" Samuel shouted, already moving to free the panic-stricken animals from their harness. Josephine leapt from the wagon just as it tipped, tumbling down the embankment with their possessions and supplies. She landed hard, the impact driving the breath from her lungs. Through the curtain of rain, she saw Samuel wrestling with the oxen's harness, trying to prevent them from being dragged down with the wagon. "Samuel!" she screamed as a section of the trail gave way beneath him. He fell, disappearing into the churning mud and debris sliding down the hillside. Without thinking, Josephine scrambled toward where she'd seen him last, heedless of the danger. The rain pelted her face, nearly blinding her as she searched desperately. "Samuel! Samuel, answer me!" A groan to her left drew her attention. Samuel lay half buried in mud, a large branch pinning his leg. Blood mixed with rain and dirt on his face. "Don't move," Josephine ordered, dropping to her knees beside him. Her hands worked quickly, assessing his injuries while clearing mud from his face. "Where are you hurt?" "Leg," Samuel grimaced. "And I think my ribs." "The wagon is gone," Josephine said grimly, "along with most of our supplies." Despite his protests, she wrestled the branch off his leg, revealing an ugly gash but thankfully no sign of a break. Using strips torn from her petticoat, she bandaged the wound as best she could in the driving rain. "We need to find shelter," she said, looking around at the unfamiliar wilderness. The wagon train had continued ahead, unaware of their predicament in the chaos of the storm. "There," Samuel pointed weakly to a dark shape in the distance. "Might be a rock overhang." Supporting his weight, Josephine helped Samuel limp toward what proved to be a shallow cave in the hillside. It was barely large enough for both of them, but it offered protection from the relentless rain. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped. They had no blankets, no food, and only the clothes on their backs. Josephine positioned herself beside Samuel, sharing her body heat. "I'm sorry," Samuel murmured, his voice tight with pain. "I should have seen the danger sooner." "Hush," Josephine scolded gently. "It was an accident. We're alive, and that's what matters." They spent a miserable night, huddled together as the storm raged on. By morning, Samuel's leg was inflamed and he was burning with fever. Josephine ventured out to search for their scattered belongings, managing to recover a canteen and a small bag of jerky. "I need to find help," she told Samuel after forcing him to drink and eat a little. "The wagon train can't be more than a day ahead." "If I start now, too dangerous," Samuel protested weakly. The trail might be washed out. And if I stay, you'll die of infection, Josephine countered. I won't let that happen, Samuel Reeves, not after everything we've been through. The determination in her voice silenced his objections. Josephine fashioned a crude walking stick from a branch, filled the canteen from a nearby stream swollen with rainwater, and set off along what remained of the trail. The going was treacherous. Mud sucked at her boots, and twice she nearly lost her footing on steep sections where the path had partially collapsed. But Josephine pressed on, driven by the knowledge that Samuel's life depended on her success. By late afternoon, exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. Her muscles screamed in protest with each step, and her stomach growled with hunger. Just as despair began to creep in, Josephine spotted smoke rising above the trees ahead. It wasn't the wagon train, but a small homestead nestled in a clearing. Summoning her last reserves of strength, Josephine stumbled toward it, calling out as she approached. A man emerged from the cabin, rifle ready, but his expression quickly changed from suspicion to concern when he saw her condition. "Please," Josephine gasped. "My friend is hurt." Our wagon was lost in the storm. The man who introduced himself as Daniel Cooper called for his wife, Martha. Within minutes, Josephine was seated at their table with a cup of hot tea while explaining the situation. "I'll get my sons," Daniel decided after hearing her story. "We'll bring your friend back here." Relief made Josephine's knees weak. Thank you so much." While Daniel and his 2 grown sons set out to rescue Samuel, Martha helped Josephine clean up and provided a set of dry clothes. "Your man is lucky to have such a devoted wife," the older woman commented. "Oh, we're not," Josephine began, then stopped. How could she explain their relationship? "We're traveling companions," she said finally. Martha raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. "Well, whatever you are to each other, it's clear you care deeply." The men returned just before nightfall with Samuel on a makeshift stretcher. He was conscious but weak, his face gray with pain. The next few days were a blur of anxiety as infection set in despite Martha's herbs and poultices. Josephine barely left Samuel's side, cooling his fever with damp cloths and coaxing him to take sips of broth. On the 3rd night, when his fever peaked and his breathing became labored, Josephine found herself praying for the first time since her mother's death. "Please," she whispered, clasping Samuel's limp hand between hers. "Please don't take him from me. I need him." Her voice broke on a sob. "I love him." The admission shocked her even as she recognized its truth. Somewhere on the long journey west, Samuel Reeves had become essential to her not just as a protector or friend, but as the keeper of her heart. "You should tell him that when he wakes up," Martha said quietly from the doorway. Josephine looked up, embarrassed to have been overheard. "You think he will? Wake up, I mean." Martha came to stand beside her, laying a work-roughened hand on Samuel's forehead. "His fever's breaking, and that man has something to live for. I can see it in the way he looks at you." By morning, Samuel's fever had indeed broken. His eyes, when they finally opened, sought Josephine's immediately. "You came back," he murmured. "Of course I did," Josephine replied, trying to mask her emotion with briskness as she helped him drink some water. "Someone has to keep you out of trouble." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "My guardian angel." They stayed with the Coopers for 2 weeks while Samuel regained his strength. Daniel helped them salvage what they could from the wreckage of their wagon, including, miraculously, most of their money which had been stored in a metal box. It wasn't enough to replace everything they'd lost, but it would give them a start when they reached Portland. The Coopers offered to let them stay through the winter, but Samuel was determined to complete their journey before the mountain passes became impassable. Daniel sold them a mule and enough supplies to see them to Portland, refusing payment despite Josephine's insistence. "Just promise to do the same for someone else in need someday," he said. "That'll be payment enough." The final leg of their journey was slower than planned, with frequent stops to allow Samuel's leg to rest. The landscape grew more verdant as they approached the Willamette Valley, lush forests and clear streams replacing the harsher terrain they traversed. Josephine found herself watching Samuel when he wasn't looking the way his hands moved as he checked the mule's harness, the thoughtful set of his mouth as he studied their crude map, the rare smile that transformed his face when something pleased him. Martha's words echoed in her mind, "You should tell him." But fear held her tongue. What if he didn't feel the same? What if his kindness was just that kindness, not love? Their arrangement had been clear from the start. He would help her reach Oregon safely, and then what? They had never discussed what would happen after. Portland greeted them with rain, a softer, more persistent drizzle than the violent storm that had nearly cost them everything. The city was smaller than Denver but bustling with activity, ships crowding the waterfront and construction underway on several streets. Samuel's cousin, Edward Reeves, welcomed them warmly to his home on the outskirts of town. A successful lumber merchant, Edward lived in a handsome two-story house with his wife, Rebecca, and their 3 children. "Your family, Sam," Edward insisted when Samuel tried to explain that they wouldn't impose for long. "And any friend of yours is welcome here." Josephine was given a comfortable room overlooking a garden where late summer roses still bloomed. After months on the trail and the ordeal of the storm, the simple luxury of a proper bed and bath felt miraculous. Yet as she settled into the soft mattress that first night, she found herself unable to sleep. For so long her focus had been on escaping Thaddeus, then on surviving the journey west. Now that she had reached her destination, uncertainty loomed. What would she do now? Where would she go? And most pressing of all, what would become of her relationship with Samuel? In the morning, Edward offered to show them around Portland. Samuel's leg still pained him after extended walking, so he stayed behind to rest, while Josephine accompanied Edward into town. "Sam tells me you're quite the artist," Edward commented as they walked along the waterfront. "I sketch a little," Josephine demurred. "It's hardly a skill." "Rebecca teaches at the girls' school," Edward continued. "They're looking for someone to instruct the older students in drawing and painting. Might suit you if you're interested." Josephine looked at him in surprise. "That's very kind, but I haven't any formal training." "Neither has anyone else in Portland," Edward chuckled. "The samples Sam showed me were impressive enough." The idea took root as Edward pointed out other aspects of the growing city: a bookshop looking for help, a new hotel being constructed, a dressmaker seeking an assistant. For the first time, Josephine began to imagine a life here, a real life, with purpose and independence. When they returned to the house, Josephine found Samuel sitting on the back porch, whittling a piece of wood into what appeared to be a small animal. "You never mentioned you were an artist too," she teased, taking the seat beside him. Samuel shrugged, his knife continuing its careful work. "Just a hobby, passes the time." "Edward showed me the town," Josephine said after a moment. "It's lovely. You think you could be happy here?" Samuel asked, his eyes still on his carving. "I think so," Josephine replied cautiously. "There seem to be opportunities for someone willing to work hard." Samuel nodded, seeming satisfied with her answer. "Edward's offered me a position in his lumber business. Says he needs someone he trusts to oversee a new sawmill he's building upriver." "That's wonderful," Josephine said, ignoring the sudden hollow feeling in her stomach. A sawmill upriver would take Samuel away from Portland, away from her. "Will you accept?" "I'm considering it." Samuel set aside his carving and finally looked at her. "But before I make any decisions, "There's something I need to say to you, Josephine." The seriousness in his tone made her heart race. "What is it?" Samuel took a deep breath. "When I offered to help you get to Oregon, I told you that what happened after would be your choice. I meant that." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "But I find myself hoping that your choice might include me." Josephine stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "Include you?" "I love you, Josephine," Samuel said simply. "I think I have since that first night you showed up at my door, brave and determined despite everything you'd been through." His hand moved to cover hers on the porch railing. "I'm not Thaddeus. I don't want to own you or control you. I just want to be with you if that's what you want too." Tears welled in Josephine's eyes, spilling over before she could stop them. Samuel's face fell, his hand withdrawing. "I understand if you don't feel the same," he said quietly. "After what you've been through, no," Josephine interrupted, catching his hand before he could pull away completely. "You don't understand at all." She took a shaky breath. "I love you too, Samuel Reeves. I think I realized it when I thought I might lose you in that storm." The smile that broke across Samuel's face was like sunrise after the longest night. His free hand came up to cup her cheek, thumb gently wiping away her tears. "May I kiss you, Josephine Ames?" he asked softly. In answer, Josephine leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, tentative at first, then with growing confidence as his arms wrapped around her, drawing her closer. It was nothing like the perfunctory kisses Thaddeus had bestowed upon her. This was a conversation without words, a promise exchanged heart to heart. When they finally drew apart, both breathless, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. "I think I'd better speak to a minister," he murmured. Josephine laughed, joy bubbling up from some long-forgotten well within her. "I think that would be wise, Mr. Reeves." They were married 2 weeks later in Portland's small Methodist church, with Edward and Rebecca as witnesses. Josephine wore a simple blue dress that Rebecca had helped her make, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Samuel looked uncommonly handsome in a new suit, his usually serious face transformed by happiness. The sawmill position proved to be an hour's ride from Portland, close enough that they could visit Edward and Rebecca regularly, but far enough to have independence. With their combined savings, they purchased a small plot of land with a sturdy cabin that Samuel immediately set about expanding. Winter settled over Oregon with a gentleness Colorado had never shown, bringing rain instead of blizzards. Josephine secured a position teaching art at the girls' school, 2 days a week, spending the rest of her time turning their cabin into a home and exploring her new surroundings with sketch pad in hand. In the evenings, they would sit before the fire, sometimes reading aloud to each other from Samuel's growing collection of books, sometimes simply talking about their day. Josephine marveled at the ease between them, the way Samuel listened when she spoke, the respect with which he treated her opinions even when they differed from his own. On Christmas Eve, Samuel presented her with a carved wooden box. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, lay her mother's locket, the one thing she'd managed to reclaim from her life with Thaddeus. "How did you save this?" Josephine gasped. "I thought it was lost in the wagon accident." "It was in my pocket," Samuel explained. "You'd given it to me to hold while you helped Martha Cooper with the washing that morning. Remember? I forgot to give it back." Josephine opened the locket to find a new addition alongside the miniature portrait of her mother, a tiny sketch of Samuel that she'd drawn during their journey and thought lost. "I had Rebecca's father, the jeweler, set it properly," Samuel said, looking suddenly uncertain. "I hope you don't mind." "It's perfect," Josephine whispered, tears blurring her vision as she fastened the locket around her neck. "The two people I've loved most in the world together." Spring brought new growth to their land and news that expanded their joy. Josephine was expecting a child. Samuel's reaction upon learning he would be a father was everything she could have hoped for. Wonder, excitement, and just enough nervousness to be endearing. "Are you happy, truly happy?" Samuel asked one evening as they sat on the porch of their now expanded cabin, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. His hand rested protectively over the gentle swell of her stomach. Josephine covered his hand with her own, feeling the flutter of their child beneath. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she answered truthfully. And she was. The woman who had fled Cannon City in terror less than 2 years ago, bruised and broken, with nothing but desperate hope to sustain her, had found not just safety but joy. The cowboy who had offered shelter on that desperate night had given her so much more than a temporary haven. He had given her the freedom to become herself again, to discover strengths she hadn't known she possessed. But most precious of all, Samuel had given her love, not the possessive, controlling claim that Thaddeus had called love, but something patient and kind, steadfast and true. A love that built rather than diminished, that celebrated rather than constrained. In October of 1881, Josephine gave birth to a son they named Daniel, after the man who had helped save Samuel's life. 2 years later, a daughter joined their family, Elizabeth, called Beth, with Samuel's thoughtful eyes and Josephine's artistic temperament. As the children grew, so did Samuel's business. The sawmill prospered under his management, eventually becoming his own when Edward decided to focus on the Portland end of the lumber trade. Josephine's reputation as an artist flourished alongside her teaching, with her landscapes of the Oregon wilderness finding homes in businesses and private collections throughout the region. They never returned to Colorado, but the past was not forgotten. Josephine kept a journal, recording their story for their children to read someday, how a desperate woman had found the courage to flee an abusive husband, and how a kind-hearted cowboy had offered shelter that grew into so much more. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Samuel surprised Josephine with a gift that brought tears to her eyes: a proper studio built onto the back of their home, with windows positioned to capture the Northern Light artist's prize and shelves for her growing collection of paints and brushes. "You've made everything possible for me," Josephine said that night as they lay together in the darkness, her head on his chest where she could hear the steady beating of his heart. "No, Josephine," Samuel corrected gently, his fingers tangling in her hair. "You made it possible. You found the courage to leave, to trust, to begin again. All I did was offer a door. And then you walked through it with me," Josephine reminded him, raising her head to meet his gaze in the moonlight streaming through their window. "Every step of the way." Samuel smiled, the expression no longer rare but no less precious for its frequency. "And I always will," he promised, drawing her close for a kiss that still held the power to make her heart race after all these years. "For as long as we both shall live." In the years that followed, there were challenges: a drought that threatened their livelihood, illnesses that brought fear, disagreements that tested their patience. But through it all, the foundation they had built held firm. Their children grew strong and confident, raised in a home where love was expressed openly and respect was given freely. Daniel followed in his father's footsteps, showing an aptitude for business that would eventually expand the Reeves lumber empire up and down the West Coast. Beth inherited her mother's artistic talents, her paintings eventually hanging in galleries as far away as San Francisco and New York. And Josephine and Samuel grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year. On summer evenings, they could often be found sitting on the porch of the home they had built, hands clasped as they watched the sunset paint the sky the woman who had found her freedom, and the man who had helped her claim it. The terror of Cannon City faded to a distant memory, a chapter in a story that had ultimately led to joy. The scars remained, visible and invisible, but they no longer defined her. What defined Josephine Reeves, née Ames, was the life she had created, the love she had found, and the strength she had discovered within herself on that desperate night when she had taken the first step toward freedom and found, in a quiet cowboy's outstretched hand, the promise of a future brighter than she had dared to dream.